I think everyone is paying a lot of attention right now to Russia and Ukraine for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
And in the op-ed that you recently released in Foreign Policy, you talked about developing a climate and trade policy with the EU to reduce Russian energy dominance in Europe. Can you explain why that is so important and how linking our climate and trade policies could achieve that objective?
Well, thanks for the question. There, I think, lots of reasons for it that are maybe fairly obvious. This is actually, Russia's energy dominance is something that's intrigued me for a long time. Obviously, coming from an oil-producing state, North Dakota, with over 1 million barrels per day, at our peak about 1.5 million barrels per day of production, number 2 in the state. The only thing that prevents us from doing more is access to global markets. And when we were able to, as you might recall, lift the export ban as part of an omnibus spending bill with President Obama and Speaker Ryan, that opened up a lot of things. And one of the things that it opened up, one of the things that it demonstrated with our ability being the United States' ability to export crude oil, we became a price leader instead of a price follower. And you saw what we expected we would see, the WTI and Brent sort of flatten out a little bit, come a little closer together. That's because of our increased, obviously, influence into the market, providing more options. So right out of the chute, there's an global economic advantage. But by looking at the Ukraine-Russia situation, which is the lens we're looking through now, it really highlights my axiom that I've always believed, and that is energy security is national security. It's economic security as well as fundamental national security. And obviously, Vladimir Putin's having much of Europe captive to his sole supply, if you will, particularly of natural gas, but to a lesser degree, but still to a degree, even electricity, at least as it relates to Ukraine. That's a lever. I've often said I'd rather use the peaceful tools of energy development than the weapons of war, and I think that's what this demonstrates. We never like a monopoly. Monopolies always lead to higher prices. It leads to captive markets and captive suppliers. I think it has. So I think obviously it has the advantage of neutralizing Russia's influence with the transatlantic partnership. That's so important. That coalition is obviously so important for lots of reasons. The other thing, though, that it does is that it helps. Competition helps bring down price. So whether it's keeping everything as is, plus adding in American and other sources of energy into an alliance, into a trade pact of some sort, it has the advantage of bringing down price because of competition, because of obviously choices, alternatives. But the other thing is this, and it's really important, I think, and that is many places, including the Middle East and including the United States, produce the same products in a cleaner fashion. And if reducing global emissions is a goal, and I think it is a goal for people on participating in this, it is for me. It certainly is for the vast majority of Americans. Then we ought to be viewing. If we're going to view climate change through a global lens, and we ought to, then we ought to also view the solutions through a global lens. And I think in that sort of a scenario, the United States does very, very well, as does the Earth.
Thank you, Senator. You both touched on 2 points that I really just want to highlight, because I think that you're spot on. One is that when we're thinking about emissions, it's a global problem, and we have to think globally, and that's clear in how the climate models work. Science is clear on that, and it's clear that our policies should reflect that issue. And the other point that you both touched on, which I think is important both domestically and in the context of Russian dominance in energy markets in Europe, is the importance of energy reliability and security and affordability. When we're thinking about energy prices here in America, whatever our climate solution is going to be, it needs to take into account that our families, our businesses need access to secure, reliable, affordable energy. And so, Senator Cramer, I think when you released that op-ed, there was a bit of a stir, at least in my world. People were their ears perked up, their eyes opened wide, and they, You're a Republican senator. You're a conservative Republican senator. You're a conservative Republican senator from North Dakota, which is, if I'm not mistaken, that's the second largest oil producing state, second only to Texas. And here you are with an op-ed about climate policy, and it's about linking climate policy and trade policy. But your argument is actually that this climate and trade policy is about markets for U.S. oil and gas. Could you just explain that a bit more?
Sure. No, it's great. It's a great observation. And this is why, first of all, this is why I appreciate this forum, because I think one of the things that keeps conservative, mean-spirited, right-wing, older Republicans, free market capitalists from talking about this stuff is that they don't want to explain it, because explaining it's difficult. But I think in what General McMaster and I wrote about in the op-ed, I think it's fairly simple to explain, but we still need the forms to explain it in. And it's this, that we have not only do we have nothing to fear from a geopolitical solution, we have everything to gain from it. It strengthens our alliances with our already natural allies, particularly our European allies. It meets their objectives of lowering emissions and finding solutions. I think it increases our influence in the world and lots of other things as well. When you're at the table, preferably at the head of the table, that everybody else is sitting around, this is a global opportunity to lead from a position of strength rather than sort of ignore it or worse yet, just shrink from it. So I think that's a big part of it. On the other hand, North Dakota is also a big coal producing state. We generate most of our electricity with coal. We do it at the mine mouth. And here's the other thing. If there's going to be an innovation solution, and by that I mean, cleaner coal, carbon capture, utilization, and storage, nuclear advancements, as well as more efficient wind, better grid systems, better efficiency, all of these things, we're going to come up with those solutions as likely as any other state, as any other country. And that becomes an additional advantage to our intellectual capabilities, to our value chain capabilities. And then suddenly the innovations that help find the solutions become another tradable a product. And so again, I just prefer to lead from the head of the table rather than the back of the room.
Thank you. So for the audience, we will in a few minutes be turning to some audience questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat in YouTube or on Facebook, or if you're watching on Twitter, you can use the hashtag BPC Live. I've got a few more questions, and then we're gonna turn to that section of the conversation here. General McMaster, you were National Security Advisor to President Trump. You know how difficult negotiating a trade deal is. Do you think this sort of proposal will find a friendly ear in Europe to actually come up with a trade deal that works for both the United States and Europe?
I don't know, but I think the chances are going way up, thanks to, as I mentioned earlier, Vladimir Putin and him demonstrating that the downside of him having coercive power over Germany and other economies. And you've seen the debate in the European Union Parliament also about designating natural gas at least temporarily, as a green fuel, in recognition that the largest reduction ever of man-made carbon emissions what was associated with the availability of cheap natural gas in the United States, right? It was a market solution. It wasn't some big plan in Washington, right? So I think there's a recognition that, hey, it's time for real solutions, no more non-solutions. You see this also with the European Union maybe designating, we'll see, nuclear as a green source of energy as well. And look at France's now strategy and the investments they're putting into it. And, we're losing that competition as well, the nuclear competition. And of course, you see who's stepping into that? China, Russia. And when they get contracts internationally, guess what? That's a long-term economic relationship that, as we're discussing, translates into geopolitical and geostrategic influence. So all this is interconnected. And you know what? If you're not on the field of play, you're going to get your ass kicked. So I think it's really important for the United States to have policies in place that allow us to get on the field and to play. And Senator Cramer mentioned some of the actions we've taken in recent years. Hey, it's time to do more. It's time to increase our ability to compete effectively. And by the way, do the right thing for the whole world in terms of cleaner sources of energy, more reliable sources of energy, so we can get at this interconnected problem set of climate and environment and energy security, and of course, as we're seeing, national and international security as well.
Yeah, if I could tag on to that a little bit. First of all, General makes a great point. Vladimir Putin is the greatest uniter in recent history, and he's helping make the point, as the General said. Last week, just over the course of the last few weeks, I'm sure a lot of you have noticed, if you've paid much attention, that a lot of European leaders are coming into the United States. I've had the privilege of meeting with a lot of them, ambassadors, energy ministers, national security advisors, and one of them that came by, called specifically to come by, was Kadri Simpson, the European Union Energy Commissioner. And I learned a lot listening to her and talking to her. And what I found is a much more of an openness to consider alternative sources of natural gas, particularly LNG. Now, we know there's a lot of we have challenges on our end of being able to provide it. These are midterm and long-term probably solutions, but they are seeing, and I think welcoming, the opportunity. One of the things I did not know, and I thought I knew quite a bit about this, was that they still have about a third of the nameplate capacity of their import terminals available for receiving natural gas. Now, there are other infrastructure challenges that have to be met, but we can meet those. We all know, I've known for a decade or longer that Spain has a lot of import terminals, but they have a mountain range, and that becomes a problem. But those are all solvable problems. And so I've taken a little heat from some of my free market friends, particularly those from the previous administration that worked really hard to deal with Europe and found it very difficult. I would submit to you that the climate is different, and particularly if we can, maybe keep it to this topic. As much as I'd love to sell more, genetically modified crops, if we can keep it to this one topic that is top of the mind for everybody and has such a direct correlation to national security, hey, I think we'd be negligent in not trying.
Hey, I just want to mention one other thing, the way this is related to geopolitics. Hey, anything that we're trying to do in this connection, right, to increase U.S. exports, to reduce dependence and reduce Russian influence and coercive power over Europe, guess who's going to oppose that? Russia. And one of the ways they're going to do that is with all sorts of malign influence and disinformation, allying oftentimes, or surreptitiously oftentimes, with green movements and environmental groups, right? This is how how Russia helped to generate a lot of opposition to shale and to fracking within Europe. So we just have to recognize there are multiple dimensions of this competition in connection with U.S. policy, EU policy, and also on the battleground of perception and information as well.
Thank you. Senator Cramer, a question for you. We all know that policy theoretically can work all sorts of ways, but at the end of the day, you have to actually agree on a policy design. For years, people thought about this border carbon adjustment as a piece of a policy around a domestic price on carbon, whether that's cap and trade or carbon tax. I think only recently have people started thinking about it as its own policy, absent a price on carbon. What do you think about that? Do you think this policy requires a price on carbon, or do you think it can exist on its own?
Well, thanks for that question, because I believe it can exist on its own. Now, there's been some discussion, some debate, I think some presumptions that aren't accurate, that some people have said, well, it's not compliant with trade policy or WTO if there's not a domestic price. We have found that, I think largely to not be true at all. I think that, in fact, I think the simpler you make it, the better, because you can, if it's a standard that if you meet it, there's nothing, and if you don't, there's a tariff. One of the things that Donald Trump taught, even us, us conservatives, us free marketers, is that America First is both popular and effective. and it's important to the United States' own security. And so I think a geopolitical alliance like this should not require a carbon price. I don't talk about a carbon price. In fact, frankly, I run from it as soon as somebody brings it up, even if it's a swell idea. I believe that increments are the way you get things done. This is one increment that I think in and of itself will make a big difference. And if that's all we do, we've made a big difference. If with the evolution of things, policy and thought, something else emerges, we'll take a look at it at that time. But I think for right now, we have an idea that can be popular, easily explained. It fits into the shifting populism of our country while recognizing our alliances and our adversaries. To me, it has all of the makings, of a good recipe for success.
All right, we're going to turn to audience Q&A, and we're going to bring back Dave Banks to field some of these questions as well. The first question we have here is from Brett, and it's what's the path forward? Is this something to talk about at the next COP? Is this something that is going to happen in U.S. Congress? What should we be looking for in terms of next steps in actually advancing this policy?
Well, I'll take a first whack at that. It certainly could and maybe should be a discussion at the next COP, but between now and then, I think some of it's happening. Some of it's happening as a result of what's taking place in Ukraine. Back to sort of the moment here, because it's highlighting the vulnerability of captivity to one source, or at least largely one source of energy for our allies. So I think now is a great time to be talking about forwarding it. That's why I bring it up to every foreign leader I can talk to. Where it's relevant. I also bring it up with my colleagues because they kind of need to be softened, to your previous point at the beginning. And and then doing forums like this. And I would look for more opportunities and more forums like this to discuss it in. And I think, let me just say it. I think this is a safe place. I really do. And when I say a safe place, I think this is a policy that provides a landing pad for the first step, or at least the next step toward perhaps bigger things. But so I just think we have to keep the conversation going. We have to be deliberate about it, but also opportunistic when the opportunity presents itself. And more, it's presenting itself. Obviously, the result of when we get done here, and when I go back and vote again, because I won't even tell you about the voting schedule. But anyway, when I leave here and go vote again, I can almost guarantee there'll be an energy reporter that asks me about this conversation. Every one of those are opportunities to forward the discussion. You guys, I shouldn't say this. I've basically stopped doing political news stations anymore. I like the business stations. I like the business networks, CNBC. I think I'm doing Squawk Box tomorrow, in fact. So CNBC, Bloomberg TV, Fox Business, because you get to have these more substantive policy discussions. And again, just keep softening, our audience, our base, with an America First energy policy, which is something we say we love.
Thank you. I'm gonna bring Dave in for a second and kind of build on that. We had an event last November with Congressman Scott Peters, Democrat, about a bill he introduced with Senator Chris Coons, also Democrat. Here we have Senator Kevin Cramer, who's a Republican. We've got people on both sides of the aisle talking about this border carbon adjustment. Like, what do you think are the chances that we can actually build on this beginnings of a policy that already has some bipartisan legs?
No, look, I think we can. I think we just need to focus at the high level concept, right? And the objectives that we want to achieve, right? And then sit down and kind of figure out, well, what's the best policy design that will achieve those objectives? I will sort of add to what the senator said about the next steps and sort of pulling this together internationally. Look, I think we should focus on a smaller group of like-minded economies working through the G7. There's no one, at least in my space, who's suggesting that we could get some kind of WTO agreement. In fact, we don't care about the WTO, to be honest. we're focused on kind of building, again, an America first climate and trade strategy that helps correct for the mistakes of the past and promotes U.S. geopolitical interests.
And then I think I will maybe conclude with General McMaster. We've talked about this a lot of times. The moment for this discussion is ripe with everything going on with Russia and Ukraine. When people are thinking about the national security implications, the geopolitical implications, what are the big takeaways that they should be drawing from the situation in Russia right now for the climate and trade conversation?
Well, we've seen that Russia uses energy supplies for coercive purposes. We should learn vicariously through the experience of Germany. We should learn vicariously through the experience of Japan. We have to recognize, hey, if we try to just leap to renewables right now, what we will do is we will create dependencies mainly on China and supply chains associated with rare earths and battery manufacturing and solar panel manufacturing and turbine manufacturing that is reminiscent of our energy dependence on the Middle East in the 1970s. Why would we want to do that? So I think what we need, again, is real solutions, no more non-solutions, and in particular to pay attention to this nexus of national security and energy security.
If I could just back that up a little bit in terms of the timing question, and Chris Coons, when you can only imagine when he read the op-ed, how kind of excited he was to say, hey, there might be a Republican in my sandbox here. And so he and I talked a little bit. Now we've been distracted by a lot of other things, but those other things actually, at that time it was BBB and a whole bunch of nonsense. Now, and in fact, I just got asked about it today by an energy or an environmental reporter about, BBB gets all this attention, it's dead, but there's talk of a climate, you bring up the climate piece of it again, all that. To which I say all the time, look, I don't care if you call it BBB climate, I don't care if you call it a climate plan, I don't care what you call it, I call it an America First energy opportunity. I think with Joe Manchin and sort of where he hangs out, and of course, he's got so much leverage, we ought to look at a plan that includes this, and if it can translate into some legislation where there are other areas where we agree. You guys, there are areas where we agree, and I'd rather have an incremental success story than an aspirational goal that we never get started on. So I'm encouraged by what David said too. I think there is a moment here to have some bipartisan discussions with people who are serious thinkers about a solution, as opposed to a fuel source. Let's focus on an emissions goal. Let's look at solutions, get together, and obviously a little compromise. But I think there's a lot more common ground than people might think if we just sit down and talk about it. And I just think this is the lowest hanging fruit, frankly.
Well, actually having some potential for some bipartisan progress on climate policy is music to my ears and music to ours here at the Bipartisan Policy Center. Thank you so much for this fascinating conversation. Thank you, General. Thank you, Senator. Thank you, Dave.